In 1799, Napoleon captured the city of Jaffa from Ottoman forces. This was but one siege in a wider campaign by the French forces to defend their trade interests and an attempt to establish French colonies in the Middle East. The siege of Jaffa, however, is noted for Napoleon's orders to murder thousands of captured prisoners of war and for the particularly disturbing acts by French soldiers during the sack of the city. In today's video, we will briefly cover the siege of Jaffa and the disturbing murder of around 4,000 people at the hands of Napoleon's army. It is perhaps helpful to start with Napoleon's aims in conquering Egypt and Greater Syria. The French were very keen to capture the Ottoman province of Egypt, as there was much curiosity about ancient Egypt at the time. Despite Napoleon controlling Egypt by land, the French navy was all but destroyed by the British in the Battle of the Nile. The Ottoman forces sensed their opportunity to strike back, sending their armies to defeat the French. When Napoleon learned of the Ottomans' movements, he led some 13,000 men into Syria to strike against Ottoman forces there. Jaffa was to be the target for the first attack against the Ottomans. Jaffa represented the only harbour along the route from Egypt to the central area. It would ensure the French would have a safe point for resupply for the ultimate capture of Jerusalem. By capturing Jaffa, Napoleon could ensure that any enemy forces would lose the ability to land their own forces in the city. The city itself was situated on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, standing over a large hill. Around the south and east of the city were a number of dense orange groves that would provide cover to the besieging forces. It had been reported to Napoleon that the walls of Jaffa were little more than garden walls. Whilst they were medieval and built before the advent of cannon, they were formidable. The French forces that were to capture Jaffa were 13,000 strong. It was comprised of 4 infantry divisions, each with a strength of around 1,000 men. There was a single cavalry division of 800 horses and a large number of artillery and engineers. As for the defenders, they were around 5,000 men along with a civilian population of 8,000. The defenders were from around the Ottoman Empire, being Albanians, Sudanese, and North Africans. A notable portion of the defenders had previously fought the French in Gaza. They had been captured and released upon the condition that they would never fight the French again. There were between 30 and 50 cannons defending the city, with much of the crew being trained by the French when there were better relations between the two. For Napoleon, time was of the essence. He needed to capture the city, defeat the incoming Ottomans, and return to Egypt to defeat the Ottoman forces that were aiming to recapture the region. Napoleon carried out a number of personal reconnaissance of the walls, narrowly evading a sniper that landed a shot through his hat. He decided that a regular siege would take too long, and committed to using the cover afforded by the orange groves to set up his artillery batteries. He would launch 2 attacks from the north and south to breach the walls with cannon fire. Then there, the infantry would establish a hold and take the city as quickly as possible. Whilst Ottoman sorties to disrupt the siege were launched, they were ultimately ineffective. Before the attack began, French messengers were dispatched to offer terms to surrender to the defenders. To the horror of the besieging forces, the messengers' headless bodies were dumped over the walls, and their heads placed upon lances for all to see. The attack began in the early morning of the 17th of March, 1799. Managing around 20 shots per hour per cannon, it would still take hours for a significant breach in the walls to be formed. Whilst the French forces attempted to exploit the breach, the defenders utilised tall buildings and towers to great effect. The concentrated fire repelled the French again and again. Despite the French even bringing a cannon to the breach, in the end, the French engineers and grenadiers managed to break into a cellar near the breach and established a foothold. By sneaking around and attacking the defenders from the rear, the French were able to enter the city, using both the breach and by wading through water to attack the harbour whilst the defenders' attention was elsewhere. Save for a few pockets of determined resistance, the city was captured at 8 PM on the 7th of March. What followed was the sacking of Jaffa by the French troops. Napoleon was well aware that he would have no control over his men during this time, and he remained out of the city until the following day. His men carried out indiscriminate murder, looting, and essay of those within the walls. This was regardless of race, religion, or nationality, with French citizens amongst those assaulted and killed. The observers witnessed such horror that they would not be able to accurately describe the crimes. A French colonel wrote in his account, "Now commenced a scene of carnage, on which it is impossible to form an idea. My pen refuses to trace that horrible picture." The reason for the barbarity cannot be simply dismissed as the typical sacking and carnage that follows a city being captured. The excesses can be in part attributed to the way that the defenders murdered the messengers, only hardening their resolve for retribution. But for many in the French army, the promises of their mission to the Middle East were falling apart. The purpose of the campaign was one of liberation, to bring enlightenment to the Middle East. Napoleon had brought a large number of scholars, scientists, and artists with him to Egypt, and had discovered the Rosetta Stone, the stone that would help scientists uncover the meaning behind hieroglyphs. But many of the soldiers witnessed firsthand a rejection by those they thought they were there to save. When disputes between the French soldiers and locals emerged, Napoleon would often side with the locals as a means to maintain the peace. He would do this even when his own men played no part in the crimes. Resentment for their supposed purpose likely found an outlet during the sack of Jaffa, with some 2,000 of the 8,000 being killed during the sacking. When Napoleon and his most trusted officers entered the city the following day, the remaining pockets of resistance surrendered. No longer did they fear their fate at the hands of the sacking soldiers. It was thought that around 2,000 men surrendered to the French. Napoleon, however, was not prepared to accept the surrender. Realizing that some of the men who were surrendering had previously promised not to take up arms against the French again, Napoleon ordered the prisoners to be murdered. His reasoning was not just that he could not trust the men to not fight a third time, but he doubted whether there was enough food to even care for the prisoners. He was not prepared to spare any of his forces to send the prisoners back to Egypt. He ordered that the prisoners be marched to the harbor's beach and executed. It is not entirely clear whether he ordered the murder of only those who had broken the terms of surrender or all of the prisoners. A large number of his war council vehemently opposed this decision. Following the sack, an outbreak of the plague ravaged both the city and the French troops. Napoleon was eager to give his men some comfort, reportedly visiting the sick and trying to encourage his men to not believe they were suffering from the plague. The legacy of Napoleon's time in Jaffa would not be the brutal sacking nor the execution of prisoners of war, but rather a painting of Napoleon visiting the sick. Exhibited in 1804, it was titled Bonaparte Visiting the Victims of the Plague of Jaffa, showing his compassion. This is what Napoleon wanted the world to see as to his actions in Jaffa. The massacres in Jaffa show not only the horrors of war and the violent toll taken upon civilians, but also the difficult choices that warfare often leads to. Rules of engagement are vital as to ensure the dignity and respect for human life, especially when the fighting has ended. It is also chilling to think that even a seasoned soldier and officer of war who would have undoubtedly witnessed extreme horrors struggled to even write about the things he had witnessed in Jaffa. Whilst some may be sympathetic to the difficult position Napoleon found himself in, when one wages war, one ought to be held to the highest of standards of conduct, and paradoxically, the standard of preserving life, even the lives of the defeated enemy.